The wind was dry that morning, carrying dust across the empty road. A thin woman walked slowly, her steps heavy, her clothes worn and faded. She held a small cloth bag close to her chest, all she owned after life had taken everything else. Her husband had died a year ago, leaving her with debts, sorrow, and a silence that followed her everywhere. The house they built together was gone. The laughter that once filled it was gone too. Now there was only the sound of her shoes scraping the dirt and the soft whisper of her prayers. She stopped by a wooden fence, looking out at a wide stretch of land, endless fields, golden under the sun, and a barn that looked older than its owner. In the distance, a man was fixing a broken gate. She hesitated. She had asked for work in every farm she passed, and each time the answer was the same. "Sorry, ma'am, we've got no place for you." But she couldn't keep walking forever. Not with her stomach empty and her shoes nearly torn apart. Gathering her courage, she opened the gate and stepped inside. The man looked up, his face shaded by a wide hat. His voice was firm but not unkind. "Can I help you, ma'am?" She nodded slowly, her hands trembling a little. "Sir, I can clean, cook, wash, anything. I just need work. I don't want charity." Her voice cracked on the last word. The rancher studied her for a long moment, then pointed toward the barn. "It's been needing a good cleaning for months. You can start there. Pays not much." She smiled weakly, relief softening her tired face. "That'll do, sir." "Thank you." He nodded once and went back to his tools, but something in her eyes made him pause, not pity, just quiet strength, the kind that comes from surviving too much. She walked to the barn and pushed open the heavy doors. The smell of hay and dust filled the air. Light streamed through the cracks in the roof, falling on broken tools and old saddles. She took a deep breath, rolled up her sleeves, and began to sweep. Each stroke of the broom echoed like a promise, not just to clean this place, but maybe somehow to start over. Outside, the wind kept blowing, but inside that barn, something small and new began to stir. The ranch sat on the edge of a quiet valley, surrounded by miles of dry grass and wind that never seemed to rest. It was a place where the days started before sunrise and ended long after the light was gone. The man who owned it, Samuel, had lived there all his life. He knew every sound the land made, the creak of the old barn doors, the cry of the hawks above, the soft snort of horses when night settled in. But what he didn't hear anymore was laughter. That had left the ranch 3 years ago, the same day his wife, Clara, didn't wake up. Since then, Samuel had learned to live with silence. It sat at his dinner table, followed him through the fields, and watched him as he tucked in his twins, Lily and Luke. They were 6 years old now, two small faces that carried the same bright eyes their mother once had. He loved them more than life itself, but love alone didn't fill the empty spaces. Raising them while keeping the ranch running wasn't easy. The days were long and the nights were longer. Sometimes he caught himself standing in the doorway of their room, just listening to their breathing, feeling that strange mix of love and fear. Fear that he wasn't enough. When the widow arrived, he didn't think much of it. She was just another worker looking for a few dollars and a place to rest. Her eyes told him she'd been through storms of her own, but Samuel had learned not to ask questions. People carried stories they weren't ready to tell, and he had his own that he didn't want to share. The barn had been sitting neglected for months. He'd meant to clean it, but every time he stepped inside, he remembered Clara brushing the horses, her soft humming mixing with the rustle of hay. He couldn't bring himself to touch anything. So when the widow began sweeping, he was almost grateful. It wasn't that he cared about the barn being clean. It was that he wouldn't have to face those ghosts himself. At first, Samuel kept his distance. He showed her where the tools were, told her what needed fixing, and then went about his work. She didn't talk much either, but when she did, her voice was gentle, steady. She moved with quiet purpose, never wasting a step, never complaining about the dust that clung to her hair or the sore muscles that surely followed each day. The twins, curious as they were, watched her from the kitchen window as she worked. Lily was the first to break the ice. She tiptoed into the barn one afternoon holding a tiny, tattered doll. The widow looked up, smiled softly, and said, "That's a pretty doll you've got." Lily nodded shyly. "Mama made her," she whispered. The widow froze for just a moment, her hand tightening around the broom handle. "She must have been a kind woman," she said softly. Lily smiled again before running back toward the house. That night, Samuel noticed something strange. Lily laughed at dinner, really laughed. It was the sound of something he hadn't heard in too long. Luke giggled too, and Samuel found himself smiling without meaning to. When he asked them why they were so happy, they just shrugged and said, "The barn lady talks nice." The next morning, Samuel passed by the barn and caught a glimpse of the widow kneeling near the horses, whispering to them as if they could understand every word. The animals, usually restless with strangers, stood calm beside her. Even the old mare, who barely tolerated anyone but him, lowered her head to let the widow brush her mane. Days turned into weeks, and without anyone noticing, the rhythm of the ranch began to change. The barn no longer looked forgotten. The tools were hung neatly, the floor swept clean, and the air smelled faintly of lavender soap. Samuel started seeing her in small, quiet moments. The way she folded her sleeves before lifting a bucket, the way her hair caught the light when she leaned toward the stalls, the way her lips moved when she whispered those soft songs. He tried not to watch, but he always did. One afternoon he found her fixing a fence that had been broken for months. "You didn't have to do that," he said, walking closer. She looked up, smiling a little. "I know, but it's work that needed doing." Her hands were scratched, her fingers covered in dirt, yet she spoke as if the job brought her peace. Samuel nodded, unable to find the right words. He hadn't realized how much he missed having someone who simply cared about the land, about the little things that kept life moving. The twins grew bolder each day. They followed her around like shadows, carrying small pails, handing her nails, feeding the chickens under her watchful eye. When they tripped, she didn't scold them. She helped them up, brushed off the dirt, and told them falling's part of learning. They liked that. They started calling her Miss Ann. Samuel noticed how his children looked happier, how the laughter returned to the house, how supper felt less lonely when they talked about what they'd done in the barn. Still, he told himself not to think too much of it. The widow was a worker, and workers always left. He'd learned long ago not to get attached. But one evening, as the sun set behind the hills, he stood at the porch watching her lead the twins back from the barn. They were all covered in dust and straw, laughing about something he couldn't hear. For a moment, he saw something that made his chest tighten, a picture of what family used to look like. And though he tried to turn away, he couldn't. Later that night, after putting the twins to bed, Samuel sat alone at the kitchen table. The house was quiet again, but not the kind of quiet that hurt. It was the kind that made you think. His eyes drifted to the window, where he could see the faint glow of a lantern from the barn. She was still working. He thought about walking out there, saying something simple like, "You've done a fine job," but the words caught in his throat. It had been too long since he'd spoken to anyone without a wall between them. So he stayed where he was, staring into the darkness, trying to understand why the sight of that faint light made him feel something he thought was gone for good. Outside, the barn door creaked softly in the wind, and inside, the widow hummed a tune that carried across the yard. Samuel closed his eyes, letting the sound fill the empty spaces of the house, unaware that this quiet, unspoken bond between two lonely souls was already beginning to change everything. The days on the ranch began to stretch into a rhythm that felt almost like music, soft, steady, and strangely comforting. Each morning, before the sun even touched the hills, the widow was already awake. The sound of her steps across the dirt path became familiar, almost part of the land itself. She would fetch water, feed the chickens, and then head to the barn with a small tin lantern swinging from her hand. The horses would whinny softly when she entered, as if they had grown used to her presence. Even the dogs stopped barking when she passed. It was as if everything on that ranch somehow recognized her calm. Samuel would watch her from a distance, pretending to check the fences or load hay, but his eyes often followed her quietly. There was something about the way she moved, unhurried, careful, always aware of her surroundings. She didn't talk much, but when she did, her voice carried warmth, even in the coldest mornings. He'd never met anyone who could make hard work look like peace, and maybe that was what drew him in, the peace she seemed to bring wherever she went. The twins began to spend more time in the barn than anywhere else. Lily liked brushing the horses. Luke liked pretending he was fixing things. The widow would guide them gently, her words always kind, her patience endless. "You don't have to rush," she told Luke one afternoon as he tried to hammer a nail. "It's better to get it right than to get it done fast." The boy smiled and tried again, slower this time. In the evenings, when the air turned cool and golden light filled the fields, the three of them could be seen sitting outside the barn, eating apples or telling stories. Sometimes the twins would ask her about her life, and she would smile, looking far away for a moment before answering. "I used to have a small garden," she'd say softly. "There were daisies by the window and a tree that gave the sweetest pears." Her voice would fade, and the children, sensing something tender behind her words, wouldn't ask more. They'd just sit close, letting her calm fill the silence. Samuel noticed the change first in his children. They laughed more. They argued less. They began to help each other without being told. Their drawings, once full of dark scribbles, now had suns and flowers and smiling faces. One night Lily handed him a picture she'd made. It was of four people standing outside a barn, the twins, a man and a woman. Samuel looked at it quietly before asking, "Who's this?" pointing at the woman. Lily smiled. "That's Miss Anne," she said. "She belongs with us." Those words stayed with him long after he'd tucked them into bed. "She belongs with us." It echoed in his head as he sat by the window, the moonlight spilling across the floor. He couldn't deny that since Anne arrived, the ranch felt different. Lighter. Alive. He could see it in the children's faces, hear it in the way they spoke. Even the old house with its creaking floors and empty hallways seemed to breathe again. The next morning, Samuel decided to bring her coffee. A simple gesture, but one that made him strangely nervous. When he reached the barn, she was sweeping near the stalls, her sleeves rolled up, a strand of hair falling loose against her cheek. He stood at the door for a moment before clearing his throat. "Brought you something," he said, holding out the tin cup. She looked surprised, then smiled, taking it carefully. "Thank you, Mr. Carter," she said softly. "That's kind of you," he nodded, unsure what to say next. They stood there in quiet, the smell of hay and coffee mixing in the cool air. Finally, she spoke again. "Your children, they're good kids. They help more than most I've known." He chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "They're a handful, that's for sure, but they mean well." Her eyes softened. "They remind me that life goes on, even when we think it can't." Her words hit deeper than she probably meant. Samuel stared at her for a moment, then looked away. "Yeah," he murmured, "it does." He left soon after, but the warmth of her voice stayed with him all day. That evening, clouds gathered across the sky. The air turned heavy, the smell of rain thick and sharp. Samuel hurried to finish feeding the animals before the storm hit. The twins were inside, but he noticed Anne still working in the barn, securing the doors and covering the feed. Lightning flashed in the distance, and thunder rolled across the valley. The first drops fell hard, drumming against the roof. The twins, frightened by the noise, ran toward the barn, calling her name. She turned and opened her arms without hesitation. "It's all right," she said, pulling them close. "The storm will pass. You're safe." They buried their faces against her chest, trembling. She sat down on a pile of hay, wrapping them in her shawl, humming a lullaby that blended with the rain. Outside, Samuel fought his way through the wind, searching for the kids. When he reached the barn and pushed open the door, he stopped. There in the dim light, he saw his twins asleep, curled up against Anne, her arms around them like she'd been born to hold them. The storm raged outside, but inside there was only peace. The sight caught him off guard. Something inside him, something he thought had died, stirred again. He stood there silently, watching her stroke Lily's hair, whispering words he couldn't hear. Her face was calm, her eyes half closed, her lips moving in a soft prayer. He wanted to say something, thank her maybe, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, he just stayed for a moment longer, letting the warmth of that small, quiet scene sink into him. When the storm finally began to fade, he closed the door gently behind him and walked back to the house. His boots left muddy prints on the porch, but he didn't care. For the first time in years, he felt something inside him settle, a strange, fragile feeling he almost didn't recognize. It wasn't just gratitude. It was something deeper, something he didn't yet dare to name. The next morning, when the sun rose over the wet fields, the world seemed new. The air smelled of rain and grass. Birds called from the trees. From the kitchen window, Samuel saw Anne leading the twins out of the barn, their hands in hers, their faces bright with laughter. And for the first time since Clara's death, he found himself smiling without reason, just because, somehow, life had started to feel beautiful again. The next few weeks after the storm carried a quiet change that nobody said out loud, but everyone felt. The barn, once a place of chores and dust, now felt like the heart of the ranch. It had warmth in it, the kind that didn't come from the sun or fire, but from something gentler, something alive. Anne still came every morning before dawn, just as she always did, but now there was a small difference. She hummed while she worked, and her hums carried through the open doors, light as the morning breeze. The twins would run out to meet her before breakfast, their laughter echoing across the yard. Even the animals seemed to lift their heads when they heard it. Samuel watched from the porch one morning as Anne brushed the old mare. The twins were beside her, giggling as they tried to braid the horse's tail. The sight made him smile without meaning to. He couldn't remember the last time laughter had filled his land like that. He sipped his coffee, his eyes soft but thoughtful. The ranch looked the same as it always had, same fences, same hills, same sky, but the feeling had shifted. It no longer felt like a burden he was dragging alone. It felt alive again. Anne didn't know he was watching most of the time. She was busy, always busy. But there were moments, quiet ones, when she would glance toward the house and see him standing there, and for a heartbeat their eyes would meet. She'd smile politely, just a small curve of the lips, and then go back to work. Still, something passed between them in those moments, something unspoken but real. At night, after the children were asleep, Samuel often found himself lying awake thinking about her. He'd tell himself it was just gratitude. She'd helped bring back light into his home, that was all. But deep down, he knew it was something more, something he didn't quite have the courage to name. Every time he thought of his late wife, Clara, guilt crept in like a shadow. How could he even think about another woman? And yet, when he saw Anne's kindness, when he heard her laugh with the twins, he couldn't help but wonder if maybe, just maybe, life was offering him a second chance. Anne felt it too, though she would never admit it. She'd been through enough loss to know how quickly life could turn cold again. The thought of belonging somewhere, of letting her heart rest, frightened her as much as it comforted her. She'd built walls around her pain, sturdy ones, and yet every day she spent with those children, with that gentle, quiet man, she felt those walls begin to crumble, one soft piece at a time. One evening, the sky turned red with sunset. Samuel was fixing the hinges on the barn door, and Anne was sweeping near the stalls. The twins were chasing each other through the hay. It was the kind of evening that made the air smell like rain and soil. Samuel glanced over at Anne and said, "You've done more for this place than you know." She looked up, surprised. "I just cleaned the barn," she said with a small laugh. He shook his head. "No, you brought life back to it." Her smile faltered and she turned away for a moment, staring at the fading light through the cracks in the wood. "I didn't mean to," she whispered. "Sometimes things just grow back when you least expect them." The way she said it made his chest tighten. Before he could say anything more, the twins came running toward them. "Papa, Miss Anne, come see." They dragged them both outside where the sky was glowing with streaks of orange and purple. Fireflies danced near the fence, blinking in the twilight. Lily took Anne's hand. "Mama used to love fireflies," she said softly, not realizing the word she'd used. The moment froze. Samuel's heart ached, not from pain but from the strange sweetness of hearing that word again. Anne knelt and smiled at the little girl. "She must have been a wonderful woman," she said gently. "She was," Samuel answered quietly. His voice trembled, but his eyes met Anne's and didn't look away. That night something shifted between them. No words were said, but the silence spoke loud enough. It wasn't love yet, not fully. It was something softer, like the first touch of dawn before the sun breaks the horizon. The next few days, however, brought a kind of unease. People in town had started to talk. Whispers about the widow working too close to the rancher. Questions about why she hadn't moved on to another job. Anne heard the words when she went into town for supplies. She tried to ignore them, but each one stung a little deeper. When she came back that evening, she was quieter than usual. Samuel noticed. "Something wrong?" he asked as they worked side by side stacking hay. She shook her head, but her hands trembled slightly. "It's nothing," she said. "Just people talk, that's all." He frowned. "Let them talk, you've done nothing wrong." But she couldn't let it go. That night, as she packed away the last of her cleaning tools, she stared at the small bag that had once carried her life from one town to another. The same bag she had when she first arrived. She'd never unpacked it fully. Maybe deep down she knew she wasn't meant to stay. Samuel found her the next morning near the barn steps, her bag beside her. "Leaving?" he asked quietly. She looked up, eyes wet but steady. "It's time, Mr. Carter. I don't want to cause trouble for you or the children." He felt something inside him twist, like a rope pulled too tight. For a moment he couldn't find the words. "You're not causing trouble," he finally said. "You've been nothing but a blessing." She smiled faintly. "Blessings don't stay forever," she murmured. She bent down, kissed each of the twins on their foreheads and whispered, "Be good for your father." They clung to her hands, refusing to let go. Lily's voice broke. "Don't go, Miss Anne, please." Anne's throat ached, but she didn't answer. She turned away before they could see her tears. Samuel stood there, silent, watching her walk down the path toward the gate. Every step she took felt heavier than the last, and yet she didn't look back. Not yet. The morning sun caught in her hair, and the barn behind her stood still, almost as if it was holding its breath, waiting to see if this time someone would stop her before she disappeared again. The morning felt different after Anne left. The sun still rose, the roosters still crowed, and the horses still called for their feed, but the air felt heavier, as if the wind itself noticed her absence. Samuel went about his chores as usual, yet every small sound reminded him of her. The broom leaning against the barn door, the folded blanket near the hayloft, even the faint scent of lavender soap clinging to the air. It was all still there, pieces of her scattered like whispers. The twins felt it too. Lily refused breakfast, and Luke sat on the porch with her doll pressed against his chest. They didn't say much, but their silence said everything. Samuel tried to keep busy. He fixed fences that didn't need fixing and repaired the barn latch for the third time that week. Work had always been his way of not thinking too much. But this time, it didn't help. No matter how many chores he did, he couldn't shake the ache inside him. The kind of ache that doesn't come from loss alone, but from realizing what you had too late. That afternoon, he rode into town for supplies. The shopkeeper greeted him, but there was a strange look in her eyes, one that made him uneasy. "Heard your barn lady left," she said casually while weighing flour. "Good woman, that one. Folks talk too much, that's all." Samuel froze for a moment, then nodded. "Yeah, good woman," he muttered, his voice low. As he rode back home, the wind pushed against him hard, like it was testing him, asking if he'd just let her go. By the time he reached the ranch, dusk had fallen and the twins were sitting by the barn steps, waiting for him. "Papa," Lily said softly, "is Miss Anne coming back?" Samuel knelt beside her, his throat tightening. "I don't know, sweetheart." Luke looked up, eyes wet. "We didn't even get to say goodbye." That night, when the house went quiet, Samuel sat at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chair across from him. He could almost see her there, brushing stray dust from her skirt, smiling politely as she always did. He remembered her laughter, the way her voice softened when she spoke to the twins, the way she made this cold, lonely house feel warm again. And then without warning, his chest filled with something stronger than regret, resolve. Before dawn broke, Samuel saddled his horse and left. The sky was still dark, the ground covered with dew. He rode fast, the wind cold against his face, his mind fixed on one thing: he had to find her. The road to town stretched far, and each mile brought back a memory. Her singing in the barn, the way she'd comforted the twins, the night he'd found them sleeping in her arms. By the time he reached the edge of town, the sun was rising, painting the world in gold. He slowed his horse near the small inn where travelers stayed. Inside, the innkeeper looked up from behind the counter. "Looking for someone?" she asked. "A woman," Samuel replied quickly. "Widow, short brown hair, kind eyes." "Carried a small bag." The woman nodded slowly. "She stayed the night, left at dawn, said she was heading east toward Mill Creek." Samuel exhaled sharply. "Thank you," he said, turning to leave. "You might catch her if you hurry," the innkeeper called after him. He rode harder than he had in years. The trail was rough, winding through the valley and up toward the hills. At one point his horse stumbled, nearly throwing him off, but he kept going. He didn't care about the dust or the ache in his legs. He just needed to see her again, to tell her she wasn't alone, that she wasn't just help, that she was home. Meanwhile, Anne walked slowly along the dirt path, her small bag slung over her shoulder. Her boots were covered in dust, her hands blistered from the road. Every step away from the ranch hurt more than the last. She told herself she was doing the right thing, that it was better this way. People talked, and she didn't want to bring shame or trouble to the man who had shown her kindness. Still, when she thought of Lily and Luke, her heart squeezed painfully. She had never meant to care so deeply, but somewhere between the sweeping and the laughter, those children had become her world. By the time she reached the edge of Mill Creek, her feet ached and her throat was dry. She found a small bench near the river and sat down, closing her eyes for a moment. The sound of water rushing over stones filled her ears. She tried to imagine a new life somewhere far away, but every time she pictured it, she saw the ranch instead. The barn, the hills, the twins running through the grass, Samuel watching from the porch. She opened her eyes, whispering to herself, "Don't look back, Anne, keep walking." But she didn't get the chance to move. The sound of hooves thundered behind her. She turned just as Samuel rode into view, his coat whipping in the wind, his face tense and desperate. He pulled the horse to a stop, breathing hard. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the river and the distant cry of a hawk. "Why did you leave?" he asked finally, his voice rough. Anne looked down, her hands twisting around her bag. "Because I didn't belong there," she said quietly. "Because people talk, and I didn't want to cause you or your children pain." He dismounted and took a step closer. "Pain?" he repeated, almost in disbelief. "And since you came, my children laugh again. My home feels alive again. You didn't bring pain, you brought life." Her eyes filled with tears. "You don't understand," she whispered. "I can't replace what you lost." He shook his head. "I'm not asking you to. No one can replace Clara, but that doesn't mean my heart can't feel again. It doesn't mean yours shouldn't." For a long moment the world seemed to hold still. The wind brushed against them, carrying the scent of the river and the faintest trace of hay from somewhere far behind. Anne's eyes met his, and in that silence, everything unspoken between them was finally clear. Samuel reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, folded paper. "I wrote this last night," he said, handing it to her. She unfolded it slowly. It wasn't a letter. It was a contract like the one she'd signed when she first came to clean the barn, but this one was different. At the bottom, instead of a wage, it simply said, "Position, stay." Not as help, as family. Her hands trembled. "You don't mean this," she said softly, almost afraid to believe it. "I do," he said. "The barn doesn't need cleaning anymore, but our hearts still do, and I don't want to do it without you." Anne pressed the paper to her chest, her tears falling freely now. Behind her, the morning sun rose higher, painting the river in gold. Samuel took a slow step forward, close enough that she could hear the hitch in his breath. "Come home, Anne," he said quietly. Please. For a moment she just stood there, the world around her blurring. Then she nodded, unable to speak. The path back to the ranch had never seemed so long, and yet, for the first time in years, it felt like the road to somewhere she truly belonged. The ride back to the ranch was quiet, the kind of silence that carried weight but not discomfort. The morning sun followed them, spilling light across the open fields, touching everything with a soft gold that made the world feel new again. Anne sat behind Samuel on the horse, her hands resting lightly at her sides, afraid to hold on too tight, afraid this might still be a dream. Every hoofbeat echoed like a heartbeat, steady and certain. She looked out over the hills, remembering the first day she arrived. The hunger, the loneliness, the way she'd walked up that same road thinking she was nothing more than a worker. But now it felt different. The same path that once led to survival was leading her home. When the ranch came into view, she drew in a slow breath. The barn stood tall in the distance, the old boards shining faintly in the morning light. Smoke curled from the chimney of the house, and the faint sound of laughter drifted through the air. Samuel slowed the horse as they approached the gate. Before he could even help her down, the front door burst open, and two small figures came running across the yard. "Miss Anne," Lily shouted, her voice high and full of joy. Luke followed close behind, his little boots kicking up dust. They ran straight to her, wrapping their arms around her legs before she could even speak. Anne froze for a moment, then dropped to her knees, hugging them tight. The children's faces were wet with tears, their laughter tangled with sobs. "You came back," Luke whispered, pressing his face into her shoulder. "You really came back." Samuel stood behind them, watching the scene unfold, his heart swelling with a quiet kind of peace he hadn't felt in years. When Anne finally looked up at him, her eyes met his, and she smiled, a small, trembling smile that said more than words could. The twins didn't let go of her hand as they led her back toward the barn. Everything was just as she'd left it, the broom propped against the door, the hay neatly stacked, the faint scent of lavender still lingering. "We tried to keep it clean," Lily said proudly. "We didn't want it to get dusty again." Anne laughed softly, brushing a tear from her cheek. "You did a fine job," she said. Samuel walked inside behind them, his footsteps echoing softly on the wooden floor. "The place missed you," he said, his tone light but sincere. "Didn't sound the same without your humming." Anne turned, her fingers tracing the edge of a stall door. "I missed it too," she said quietly. The rest of the morning passed gently. The twins helped Anne unpack what little she had, just a few folded clothes, a comb, and a small book of psalms worn from use. Samuel found her a small room near the kitchen, with sunlight spilling in through the window and the smell of fresh bread drifting from the stove. "It's not much," he said, rubbing the back of his neck, "but it's yours if you'll have it." She looked around, her throat tight. "It's more than I ever hoped for," she whispered. Days turned into weeks again, and the ranch settled into a rhythm that felt right. Anne cooked with the twins, mended clothes, and helped Samuel with the accounts. In the evenings, they all sat on the porch together while the sun sank behind the hills. The twins would fall asleep in the rocking chairs, and Samuel and Anne would talk in low voices about the land, the weather, the small things that made up life. The conversations were simple, but they carried warmth, like two souls learning how to breathe in the same rhythm. One evening the sky was streaked with pink and gold, and the air was cool enough for sweaters. Samuel leaned back in his chair, watching Anne as she braided Lily's hair. "You know," he said, his voice low, "I never thought I'd see my children this happy again." Anne smiled faintly without looking up. Children have a way of finding light, even when grown folks forget where it is. He studied her for a moment, his eyes soft. "And what about you? Have you found your light again?" She paused, her hands stilling in Lily's hair. "I think I'm beginning to," she said. "It's hard to find light when you've lived so long in the dark, but sometimes all it takes is a door being opened." Samuel's gaze lingered on her. "Then I'm glad I opened that barn door," he said quietly. She laughed then, a soft, genuine sound that seemed to lift the air around them. A few days later, they decided to take the twins to the river, the same one where Samuel had found her. The children ran ahead, skipping stones across the water while the two adults stood side by side on the bank. The sky reflected in the water and the world felt still. Samuel looked down at her, his voice low and steady. "I want to ask you something," he began. "Not as an employer, not even as a friend. I want to ask you as a man who's been given a second chance." Anne's eyes met his, wide and searching. "What is it?" He took a breath. "Stay," he said simply. "Not because you owe me or because the children need you, but because I do. Because this house, this ranch, it's home now. But it's only complete if you're part of it." For a long moment she didn't speak. The sound of the river filled the air and a soft wind brushed through the grass. Her hands trembled slightly as she looked out over the water. "You don't know what you're asking," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've lost everything once before. I don't know if I can bear to lose it again." Samuel stepped closer, his voice calm but firm. "Then don't lose it. Stay and let it be found again." She turned to him then, really looked at him. The lines on his face, the steadiness in his eyes, the gentleness she'd come to trust. And slowly she nodded. There were no grand gestures, no promises of forever. Just that small nod, enough to say, "Yes, I'm here." When they rode back to the ranch that evening, the twins were singing a little song they'd made up, their voices bright against the hum of crickets. The air smelled of pine and soil, and the barn stood waiting, its doors open wide as if welcoming them home. Samuel lifted Luke from the saddle while Anne helped Lily down. The children ran ahead, their laughter spilling through the twilight. Anne turned to look at the horizon one last time, before going inside. The sky was darkening, the first stars beginning to show. She closed her eyes for a moment, breathing in the quiet peace around her. For the first time in years, her heart didn't ache with emptiness. It felt full, fragile, yes, but full. Behind her, Samuel's voice was soft. "Come inside," he said. "Supper's getting cold." She smiled and followed him through the door. The light from the kitchen spilled out across the yard, warm and golden, touching the edge of the barn like a promise. The wind carried the faint sound of laughter, and somewhere in that sound, life began again.